next part of our conference this afternoon is we looked elsewhere. We start to see where else can we draw in expertise on, particularly on the idea of best practice, on the idea of frameworks, on how to set standards for media literacy for ourselves here in Europe. So we have been joined, first of all, we will be joined this afternoon, first of all, by Yonty Friesem. He's the Executive Director of the Media Education Lab, Illinois Media Literacy Coalition in the States. Yonty, we're going to ask you to take us through your presentation, where you will be talking about the Media Production Hive, which is a framework for practice and for evaluation. So over to you.
Thanks. Thank you, Sally. Very excited to be here. I'm going to share my screen. Let me know if you see my screen.
Almost. It's coming.
Okay.
Yes, see your screen fine now.
Okay. Just coming from Chicago to Europe, it takes time. Okay, so hi,
early.
everybody. So as I call myself a recovering high school teacher. That's why I started the journey feeling not much supported. And then in the last 20 years, I've been thinking, how can we support media educators? So I'm mainly coming with a background in filmmaking. And so I'm going to talk about how am I evaluating media production in the class, which from video moved also to be gaming, to be poetry, music, radio, podcast. So any media production, writing a book. And so to start with that, I very quickly, this was in 2010, thinking what are the media, the skills for the future, which we passed that. But you can see there in the middle, there is new media literacies, there is social intelligence, cognitive. And then I tried to see what is there now that exists. And this is from McKinsey talking like 10 years from now. And what's interesting is if I look at all the red parts here that I highlighted, those are things that we're doing when we're teaching media literacy, and especially when we're teaching media production, which have the media analysis incorporated in it. So it's interesting that as the panel before me said, it's kind of the world is coming to us kind of saying, yes, it's something that should be funded, it's something important. And so we still need to explain why we need it, but we're there already. And I wanted to share several standards that I'm using, and I'm going to explain how I built my Media Production Hive. I used here the executive functioning, because when that's from special education, but when you are able to inhibit, shift emotional control, so behavioral regulation, then you have the place for cognition to initiate, working memory, plan organizing, organization of materials, and monitor. And those are standards for people to successfully reach and do an assignment, which is a skill that all of us should have. And that was helpful to think about what happens when we're doing a media production with kids and youth. And so also I'm going back to the Bloom taxonomy, which is another standard that is very known. And everybody's talking about the Bloom taxonomy, about the cognitive domain, but actually there was three evaluation that were done also about the affective domain. There was also kinesthetic, but I'm not getting there. And so this is like obviously 56, so it's pretty old, but it has been revised and looking in a newer way and changing a little bit the rating and changing some of the standards there to look at creation as the top cognitive domain. And from the, and the communication skills are all with it. You can have here like, you have a link if you want to go and see it. But from the social and emotional, we can see in the US, there's those 5 main standards for social and emotional learning that Castle has been working on for 2 decades almost. So taking that was the inspiration for what I'm going to talk about, but there is a lot of argument about what is media literacy. And so in Illinois, we're the first state in the US that mandated to teach media literacy in every high school. That happened a little bit more than a year ago. and we're in the process of figuring out how to assess what's the impact after more than a year of it. So they took the American definition of media literacy as the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and communicate using a variety of objects and forms. As a student and colleague of Dr. Renee Hobbs, I use those 5 competencies. But interestingly, when I was delving into UNESCO discussion in the last 3 decades, I could see that first they talk about media education, and then they shift to media literacy, and now it's information and media literacy. But what's interesting when we're talking about media literacy, to understand that media literacy is the outcome of the media education process. And that's something that took me time to understand, because in many languages, media literacy doesn't exist as a phrase. Now it's a little bit more common. But to understand that media literacy is the outcome of the media education process. So how do we do media literacy and how do we assess it? So I used Daniel Goleman and Peter Senge's book, The Triple Focus, that talk about you need to look at the inner, the self-reflection, the other, empathy to the other person, and then focus on systematic thinking, the outer. And they claim that by focusing on the inner, other, and outer, you can really reach leadership and be able to function as a citizen in the digital age. So I took this framework and tried to think about, if you do media production, what are the personal skills, the social practices, and the production stages, and how can we assess them? And so how does it look like, the triple focus in production? So if we talk about systematic thinking, the outer, we talk about civic engagement, the connection, the procedures of making media. Collaboration, we talk about empathy, communication, teamwork. And in the personal skill, we talk about confidence, perseverance, executive functioning, and media literacy skills. So all of that sounds great in theory, but how does it come into play? So I'll try very shortly to go over and explain. There is an article that I wrote 2017 that you can go there and see the description of the Media Production Hive more in detail. And I'm always happy. I'll put my contact in the chat when I'm done. Happy to discuss and share if people are interested. So the first stage is access. Do you have access to the tool? Do you analyze and see other examples? And then it's the exploration process. So how does it work to have access to the equipment, to then analyze examples of other media production, to be inspired, and then explore as a stage? So you can see here a middle school that did a marketing activity. They looked at other marketing. They looked at the equipment they have here, like green screen and different, and they were exploring. That was the first phase of them creating. I'm not going to share here the video that they did, but basically it was the beginning of the process of creating a commercial for a social cause that they wanted in their school. The second stage is, okay, so I had those exploration. What do I do now? So I synthesized it. I brainstormed with my partners, my teamwork, and then we get to the ideation of what we want to do. Since I don't have time here, I did create rubrics that teachers basically are looking at it if they did it or they didn't do it. So it's a very kind of binary assessment, so it's easy to see. Did they synthesize? Did they brainstorm? Did they ideate? Did they access? Did they analyze? Did they explore? To make it easy for the educator to assess and also the observer in the classroom. You can see here in a charter school, they were analyzing media representation. They're doing community work, and they're looking at different drug, alcohol abuse, suicide. This is an area in the US that has a high level of suicide, and we're trying to think how they can address it from a media production perspective. The third stage is initiating. So who is initiating what? Who's taking responsibility and saying, I'm going to be this, I'm going to be this as a team? Then how do they negotiate? Who is doing what? What is going to happen with their production. And this is the planning phase. This is your role. You're going to do it this time. You're going to do it this time. How do they actually create an actual schedule? You can see here in the sixth graders that did research about homelessness, and they interviewed the mayor, and they created 3 different podcasts and did research in their class. Each one had a role, and when there's 2 students that were a little bit disruptive and didn't really got into work, I offered them, okay, maybe you do a video game, and they were thrilled. So they were working on creating a video game instead of the podcast that the others did. So that was part of like the initiating. Some had issues with initiating, taking responsibility. How do they planning on what they're going to do? Then we're getting to the production itself. Each one creates their own part, and then they're collaborating together into like putting it together as one piece. So this is the production one. This is where things can break down. And if they were able to actually create something and put it together, we can see the successful project that they did at this point. So we can see here, as I said, this is part of a big project that I did in Taos, New Mexico. And you can see here that the Tiwa Day School, the after school program did a violent suicide prevention work, doing a PSA, a public service announcement, and putting those You Matter posters on the bridge to prevent suicide and address climate change and homelessness in their city. The next stage is modifying. So, okay, you did something together, but you need to edit, to monitor what the others did, give them feedback. How does that work as a group to work together? And that's the editing phase of any media production that you're doing, even if you do a web design or song or poetry. So you see here the poetry radio show that the day school of the Tiwa tribe did. We helped them create a radio station in the school. Here is the kindergarten doing public speaking. And they, during poetry week, they created poetry from their own experiences and put it all together as they were editing in the studio, learning how to do that. And so a stage that is super important and usually neglected is the engage one. Because just doing the media production with no audience is not really engaging for students, learners. And so the fact that you can engage with actual audience, have them reflect, and have a showcase of what you did is super, super important. So with this project, you can see the high school recycling campaign. They did a whole showcase. People came, saw what they did. They created a website, so it's also available online for people to look at and to get feedback of what worked and what doesn't work from the recycling in their village. We also had the conference that we had all the different initiatives come and present, because it was important for them to get feedback from adults and have kind of showcase to see how that worked. And the last thing is the action. The community action, the civic action. What is all this media production impact is going to have? And so just to summarize quickly, so there's the personal skills, which is more the media literacy, the access, synthesize, initiate, create, modify, and engage that can be measured in a project, like Igor said, like with pre-test and post-test. And there is the collaborative, the social part. Do they know how to analyze, brainstorm, negotiate, collaborate, monitor, and reflect? And there is the procedure. Do they understand how a process of making media is done from exploration to ideation, planning, production, editing, showcase? And all of that leading eventually to an action that help us contribute to the community that we live in. So I leave you here with that. Happy to answer questions later, and I'll put my contact info in the chat. Thank you.
Yonty, thank you so much. That's a really interesting framework indeed for everybody. There's lots of comments in the chat, but not a lot of specific questions. So I'll leave you to read the comments and the feedback. But one thing that just struck me, because we know from people joining sessions like this, we're always keen to share best practices and resources that can be reused. So for example, those rubrics that you mentioned earlier for teachers, are those available? Can people have access to that kind of material from you?
They need to contact. That's part of what we're, being hired to do. So it's part of our work with professional development at the media education line. When we work with school district, when we work with teachers. So I'm happy to share, not as a large, but on a personal and with people who will
Sure.
talk to
Sure.
me. Yeah.
So contact Yonty with that.
Yes. And
Also a
I'll put.
question, and I see there's a question also in from Arilyn, just in terms of, you talked about the children as journalists. Was there a journalism aspect to the project?
Yes. So what happened is similar to the work that Igor is doing and Vitor is doing, because I know, we're collaborating, so I know what they're doing. We had journalists who came to the school to help the teachers. So the whole aspect here was to have teachers who are not media literacy experts to implement media literacy by telling them, you don't need to be the subject expert. You need to be the practice, the adult in the room. And we're going to support you. So the elementary teacher who was doing the podcast was terrified of doing a podcast. But as we had the journalist helping her and coming and doing the podcast, she felt she can have her students work on research, but she doesn't need to do the actual journalism practices, because there's experts who are coming. There's experts in storyboard, experts in lighting, experts in radio that came and helped and supported the teachers.
It's a nice collaboration. I think we're familiar with this also in Europe, of course, where we have initiatives like lie detectors, where we have journalists going into schools. So it's a well-known approach, and a very effective one, of course. Yonty, thank you very much. You're staying with us anyway for the rest of the afternoon. I'm going to switch now to Canada, and I'm delighted to welcome Matthew Johnson. Matthew is Director of Education with Media Smarts in Canada, and we asked him to come and talk to us about ensuring standards of best practice in media literacy in Canada. Matthew.
Thank you for having me. And just want to confirm that my my shared screen is showing up for everyone. All right, thank you. I'm going to try and stay on schedule, because I have a lot of slides, but each one is short. So let me start by telling you a little bit about Media Smarts' approach, which we use the phrase digital media literacy in Media Smarts to recognize that digital literacy doesn't replace or run parallel to media literacy, but rather builds on it, while incorporating new concepts that arise from the differences between broadcast and digital media. In particular, the fact that digital media are networked, and I'll come back to that. But at the same time, many digital issues can't be understood without what we identify as the key concepts of traditional media literacy. We define a media literate person as someone with the skills, the knowledge, and the critical capacity that are traditionally included in both media literacy and digital literacy, and an understanding of the connections between them. And we divide these into three categories of learning goals. First, what students need to know, the content knowledge, the concepts that they need to be able to understand and to apply as critical lenses when considering media products or experiences, and what they need to be able to do with media. Our framework topics are the specific content that students need to know about different digital media topics. Everything from how camera angles influence how we interpret a movie scene, to what their privacy rights are under Canadian and international law. The key concepts are what students need to understand about digital media literacy in order to ask and investigate critical questions. And our core competencies are what they need to be able to do, the skills, the strategies, and the processes that enable them to be active rather than passive users of media. So let's take a quick look at how we approach each of these in our classroom materials. Based on our groundbreaking research on digital media literacy education in Canada, our model curriculum provides a framework for integrating digital media literacy in Canadian schools. These range from topics more strongly associated with what might be called traditional media literacy, such as how different groups are represented in media, to ones like privacy and security, which are most relevant in a digital context, to topics like media health or making and remixing, which span both traditional and digital media. The key concepts of digital media literacy are what students need to understand in order to be media literate. They don't need to be able to articulate these concepts or learn them word for word, but they do need to be able to use them to ask critical questions and to understand media phenomena. We work from a set of 10 key concepts that are grouped into two groups of 5. The first of these are those that were developed by media educators in the 1980s, who synthesized a range of academic fields and identified which elements were most important for students to understand by the time they graduate, and then simplified them into a framework that was accessible by teachers and applicable for students. Of these first 5, the most fundamental, the one of which the others are all implications, is the idea that media are constructions, that they were made by people who made choices, even if those choices weren't always free or even always conscious. These original key concepts, as I mentioned, were developed in the 1980s when the media landscape looked like this. Content only flowed one way. Producers created it, then sold or licensed it to distributors, who then brought it to you. But of course, in digital media, in today's media ecosystem, we're no longer the final link in a distribution chain, but rather a node in the middle of an infinite network. We can share content with other people as easily as a professional producer or distributor shares it with us. Collaboration and dialogue are the norm, rather than solitary creation and broadcasting, and we can sometimes change the content or interact with the content that we see. So while those original 5 concepts still apply to all media, in order to engage specifically with digital media, we need to address the fact that it is networked, with every part being linked to every other part. These links are always at least two-way, even if you're not aware of the ways in which you're sending information back. Our core competencies, what students need to be able to do, are the skills that students need to make effective, ethical, critical, and engaged use of media tools of all kinds. Competencies for digital media literacy can be classified according to 4 main principles: being able to access media, being able to use it safely, effectively, and responsibly, being able to understand it as a critical user and consumer, and to engage with it as a digital citizen. As you can see, access is both a competency of its own, but also a precondition on which all of the others rest. Now, a frequently asked question about digital media literacy is, does it work? And the short answer is yes. Digital media literacy interventions have been shown to be effective in addressing topics ranging from advertising to body image to racism and stereotyping, sexual health, and tobacco use. But at the same time, some interventions have been found not to be effective, or in some cases, even to backfire. So I'm going to look now at what our review of the research and some of our own research as well have shown are the hallmarks of effective media education, what some of the risks of backfire are, and how to mitigate them. First, in terms of best practices, emphasizing hands-on involvement by exploring topics that are directly relevant to students, promoting engaged citizenship, and providing students with authentic tasks and experiences, which give them an emphasis on student engagement with media in an interactive and a dynamic way. Next, allowing students to be the content experts when it comes to their online activities and their own media spheres, their media worlds. Giving them opportunities to make media as well as to critique it, especially in ways that help them better understand the workings of media industries, and teaching students a critical vocabulary for reading, analyzing, and discussing media. Now, while it's valuable for digital media literacy to have a designated space in the curriculum, it's most effective when it's also represented across all content areas and integrated into them rather than treated as an add-on. As much as possible, parents should be involved in media education, and it should make connections with the world outside the classroom. Finally, media education should allow plenty of time for exploration, for practice and reflection, providing students with more than one opportunity to learn and practice each digital media literacy skills. Journals, debriefs, and other reflection tasks can be useful for making student learning visible. Now, as with almost any discipline, media education can do harm when it's done badly. Some of these effects are particular to the specific topics. For instance, we know that approaches to misinformation that don't recognize the implications of network digital media that were developed in the broadcast media environment can actually make students less able to recognize misinformation and to discriminate between reliable and unreliable sources. Similarly, some interventions that focus on discourage youth from sending sexts have been found to make those who share sexts feel better about doing so because the interventions contribute unintentionally to victim blaming. But there are also broader risks associated with digital media literacy in general. And by looking at these ways that media literacy can backfire, we can identify specific practices and attitudes to avoid in media education. These broad risks we've identified as resistance, backlash, the third-party effect, and cynicism. Perhaps the most common backfire effect is simply students resisting or challenging the validity of digital media literacy as a practice. This may take the form of arguing that the teacher is taking media too seriously, that the work being discussed is just an ad, or that nobody thinks about it that much, and that media therefore have no meaning or impact. In the context of learning about the risks and possible consequences of media use, resistance may come in the form of what's called the personal fable, a psychological mechanism that leads tweens and teens to see themselves as special and unique and therefore immune to danger. To a certain extent, we teachers, and I was a classroom teacher for about a decade, we teachers have ourselves to blame for this attitude, because the works that we tend to teach as texts are overwhelmingly serious books whose authors had a clear intended meaning. Books like Animal Farm, The Handmaid's Tale, and Lord of the Flies, and these three are still very widely taught here in Canada. Now, these books we teach because they are easy to teach, because they have a clear meaning, but when we focus primarily on texts like this, it promotes the misconception that works can only have meaning intended by their makers. It's important, therefore, to help students understand the key concept that all media works have social and political implications, even if those weren't consciously intended by their makers, and that indeed those unconscious implications are significantly more common. Because the effects that media have on us are often cumulative, stereotypes, for instance, are almost always the result of many portrayals rather than a single one, we can also avoid resistance by focusing on students' media spheres rather than individual works. Our key concepts provide students with conceptual lenses to help them examine how media are constructions, imperfect representations of reality, before we discuss their social and political implications. One way of doing this is to think of a subject that you know something but not a lot about, maybe cooking, mountain climbing, elephants, Japan. Consider how much of what you think you know actually comes from media representations of that thing. Thinking then about the accuracy of that kind of information is an important first step before we can consider the impact of media on how we understand things that are more emotionally or politically charged, things like gender, violence, or the justice system. Resistance can also happen when students feel we're criticizing things they enjoy. For that reason, we need to draw a distinction from early on between critiquing something and criticizing it, and make clear that we can critique something that we personally like, or critique elements of a work while praising others. It's also valuable to highlight what we see as positive examples, authentic representations of diversity, apps that actually do respect young people's privacy, video games that encourage creativity, and so on. The same thing applies when we're talking about the possible risks and consequences of using and consuming media. Our practice must reflect students' experience. If we cherry pick the worst examples, whether we're talking about ads or cyberbullying incidents, students will see that what we're teaching doesn't match their reality and simply tune us out. Not only doesn't this work, it can actually backfire as well because it makes risky behaviors like sexting or cyberbullying to seem more common and normative than they really are. And in fact, for bullying, we know one of the most reliable, the most effective approaches is to simply let kids know it's less common than they think it is. The third party effect is the sense that while media may have an impact on others, we are immune. This may be a cause of resistance for those students who already see themselves as too savvy to be fooled by media, but it may equally occur in students who are enthusiastic about digital media literacy and feel that it's armed them too well to be manipulated. The third party effect also occurs when we assume that only certain people, different ages or genders or political views, for instance, are susceptible to different media effects. While there is evidence that certain groups and individuals are affected differently by media, no one is immune. We need to communicate to students that digital media literacy doesn't make us immune to media effects, but only able to be on guard for them and to engage with them critically. Providing students with evidence of their own susceptibility to media effects, such as by exploring how food companies create parasocial relationships through advertising and social media, has been shown to do this. As teachers, admitting our own vulnerability can also be helpful. Some ads reliably make me cry, for example, even as I recognize the techniques they use to do so. We can also highlight how advertisers flatter us by playing on the third-party effect. And this is a bit of a parody of a long-running brand in Canada, what's called the No Name brand, that does exactly this. Backlash can result when students feel the teacher is pushing their own views or interpretations, rather than encouraging students to articulate and argue their own. When we're teaching about industry practices that we feel are clearly harmful, it's easy to fall into a protectionist stance, where our goal is to lead students to a particular view or behavior rather than fostering critical thinking. While this may work in the short term, it greatly raises the potential for backlash, especially as students enter their teens and become more suspicious of authority. For this reason, some experts have argued that media education should be rigorously non-ideological, but how can we discuss the social and political implications of media, never mind subjects such as news and misinformation that are explicitly political, in a non-ideological way? Rather than pretending to be apolitical or trying to teach both sides, what's most effective is to approach each topic with open-mindedness and even-handedness, but not neutrality. A key to this, and to avoiding the impression that you're telling your students what to think, is to distinguish between fact and opinion questions, and also between active and settled questions. Fact questions, of course, are those that can be conclusively answered, proven, or disproven, while opinion questions are ones that can't be conclusively answered, but can be supported by argument or evidence. Settled questions are those that are no longer up for debate, either because they're fact questions that have been conclusively proven, or opinion questions that society has come to a firm opinion on. For instance, should food companies be allowed to advertise is pretty much a settled opinion question. Should food companies be allowed to advertise to children is not. It's an active question. Teachers should establish which questions they consider settled and which are still active ahead of a discussion, as well as which values and positions they consider to be out of bounds, and then allow any position on an active question within those bounds to be judged on its merits as an argument. As well as being open about our own views, it's important to explicitly model a critical attitude towards them by always asking, what do I already think or believe about this? Why do I want to believe or disprove this? And what would make me change my mind? The goal should not be to lead students to any particular perspective, but rather to develop their critical loyalty, where they still hold strong values and beliefs, but adopt a critical stance when evaluating an argument, even when it aligns with their own beliefs. Perhaps the most frequently voiced concern about digital media literacy is that it leads students to become cynical rather than skeptical, doubting that anything is true or can be trusted. This can be the result of what we might call folk media literacy, a version of the discipline that simplifies it to an instruction to question everything, or as being about just looking past the mainstream media. This isn't only wrong, but actively harmful, Teaching students to question everything without showing them how to identify which sources are reliable enough to be worth their attention results in trust compression, where all sources are seen as equally untrustworthy. To avoid this, we have to frame digital media literacy as being about evaluating and verifying sources rather than debunking them. For instance, in our Break the Fake resources, we make sure that at least half of the examples and exercises end by showing that something is true, including hard-to-believe examples ranging from a picture of Aquaman being displayed in the US Congress to the Queen having been given a gold-plated video game system. Finally, the best way of avoiding or mitigating all of these risks is to take a holistic, comprehensive approach to digital media literacy. By teaching how to read media, how it affects our views of different groups and of the world, how the media industry works, how we can use media tools safely and ethically, and all the other aspects found in our framework, we can provide students with a balanced view that serves as a foundation for the lifelong development of their media literacy skills. Thank you.
Matthew, thank you so much. That is really interesting, and lots of discussion back and forth in the chat at the moment. There was a question for you, but I think it has been answered already by Yonty, looking for further research and further resources on the backfire idea, on backlash, how to identify that. So if you can add to that, that would be great. I just had a very quick question for you. Do you, in Media Smarts, do you identify best practices? Do you say, here's a list of 10 good projects?
No, we haven't really identified it in terms of projects. Certainly, if you look at our article on best practices and follow the sources, a lot of those come from evaluations of individual projects. So we've kind of boiled it down to identify the lessons that came from those evaluations. But if you did want to identify the practices or the projects that led to that, that's on the website.
That's on the website. Okay. Look, thank you very much. We're going to move on because we want to make sure. Is there another question in there? Any recent research on cynicism from Aralyn?
Actually, there was a study just yesterday that came out. It wasn't specifically about cynicism, but it was looking at the relative value of providing true and false examples. So providing opportunities to debunk and opportunities to verify in interventions relating to misinformation. And it actually, I was very pleased to see that it really confirms our approach. I think there, in that it recommends going roughly half and half, and in some cases actually recommends having more true than false examples. We do go into, again, that article is about 2 years old now, so there is some more recent material that's been published since, but it largely, from what I've seen, largely replicates past findings, which again is that an emphasis on debunking is, or an emphasis on, again, on teaching people to question without teaching them how to find the answer, essentially, are the things that are most likely to contribute to cynicism or trust compression.
Look, many thanks. If you find any links like that, put them into the chat. The chat is really very lively at the moment with lots and lots of resources and contacts. And thank you to everybody who's introducing themselves as well there. It's lovely to see people joining us from many different parts of the world this afternoon. So I'd like to move on to our third speaker for the session now. So I'm really delighted to welcome Megan Fromm. She's Education Manager with the National Association for Media Literacy Education in the US, NAMLA. And we've all been looking with interest and following the work that NAMLA has been doing, and specifically the core principles. So we asked Megan to give us an overview, a little bit of background on the core principles. Megan, you're very welcome.
Thank you so much for having me here. This has been already so wonderful to dig in on what is happening across the world and to realize the depth of resources that are coming out. So I wanted to take just a few minutes to share, and hopefully you all can see my screen as well, that we are good to go there. We have recently released an updated core principles of media literacy education. And what I want to sort of preface this conversation by saying, this is a document or a resource that has a really specific audience, and we're envisioning teachers and facilitators of media literacy education. our network at Namely is quite wide. We obviously have members who are educators and facilitators, but we also have members who are from tech companies, from media organizations, producers, activists, other media education nonprofits. And so to be able to sort of talk about something that might serve everybody is probably not actually that useful. So I think it's important to look at this with the context of its intended audience. And so we are thinking specifically about how do we describe what quality media literacy education looks like, and how do we give guidance to those who are doing this practice in various and, in fact, different ways across, especially the United States, although we are really excited to be working on translations of this document. And I put in the chat, I put a link to the extended version of this. I'm going to highlight a few points, but it might be easier to open up the PDF on your end so that you can see it more clearly. It's quite a hefty document, and it's a little bit hard to convey in just a slideshow. But this is something that we released this year. The original core principles were constructed in 2007, and the world has changed quite a bit since then. And so they were in dire need of some updates. When we are thinking about the domains and the components that go into media literacy education, which is the term that we use to describe how we teach the skills of media literacy, we were thinking about sort of these 5 areas to make sure they're represented when we talk about what high quality media literacy education looks like. And so we're thinking, of course, about the learning environment. We're thinking about the ways in which media literacy education takes place, where it happens, the manner of that learning. We're also, of course, thinking about educators, and those educators could be formal educators in a classroom setting. They might be facilitators in community workshops. They might be by proxy, education by proxy, through the ways in which we might legislate or try to have policy around media literacy education. We're also thinking about, of course, the learners, those who are engaging. And we know that media literacy education is a lifelong process. So we're not just thinking about learners as, primary or secondary or even simply university levels. We're thinking about learners of all ages. And in fact, some of the work that we're increasingly doing in the United States is older level learners. And so how do we reach populations beyond the traditional school age populations? We are thinking about, in this revised document, one of the major catalysts for revising the core principles was a need to better articulate how systems and institutions are interacting with media, creating media, and impacting what we understand about the world because of how their systems and institutions operate. So we're thinking about political systems, technology systems, media systems, social, cultural systems, how all of those interact to create impact and to shape the media experience of any learner. And then we also learned, and I should mention that these revisions were the result of focus groups and surveys that were done over the course of more than a year. We learned that people, at least in the United States, in our community, were very much interested in having more specific values articulated in media literacy education. So in revising this document, we were looking at better exploring and explaining what values uphold media literacy education and what values are revealed through media experiences. And so I think it's important to understand that these were the things that we identified were really in need of articulation to get us to this newer version of the core principles. The new version of the core principles identifies 10 ways that we can create best practices in media literacy education. And from our perspective at Namely, it's really important for us to say that we think these principles are aspirational and inspirational. Media literacy education, as you all know, is it's challenging to do it in any given space, depending on resources, time constraints, the education of the facilitator, the expertise, the political climate, the cultural climate. We are looking at this as the long game, quite simply. So how can we identify practices that if media literacy education is really robust, it's really going well, and it's implemented at a high quality standard, what would it look like? Knowing that it's okay that we maybe can't do all 10 of these all the time in every single scenario. And in our work, we want, especially given the constraints of the American education system, to sort of empower teachers to do media literacy education wherever they are at, and help them understand that if they aren't feeling like they're executing all 10 of these principles, we can start somewhere, and maybe we can build, and hopefully we can build, but we don't want these to be preclusive. So when we think about these, and again, hopefully you can see in your own PDF, I know this may not be big enough, but I wanted to point out a couple revisions, a couple new principles that I think are really essential for how we think of best practices in media literacy education. Many of these principles already articulate what you've heard from Matthew and Yonty and the incredible work that you all are doing in your own communities. And then there are a couple here that I think are really unique to what NAMELY wanted to say about the field of media literacy education. So I would point you to core principle number 5, which says that media literacy education necessitates ongoing skill building for learners that are integrated, cross-curricular, interactive, and appropriate for age and developmental stage. We are having a cultural moment in the United States in which there is higher pervasive activity of censorship. Is probably the least diplomatic way I can say it. Censorship is just everywhere, of books, of curricular materials, of education content. And a lot of those are based on the false notion that educators are providing inappropriate material to students of different ages. And in fact, the term media literacy has been weaponized by some groups in the United States to be political or part of a specific political ideology. And in articulating these new core principles, we wanted to remind people that educators who are trained to do education and who have the expertise and the support to teach this topic understand that there are age and stage requirements for media literacy education. So media literacy education, just like any other area, builds over time, and it builds in relation to the stage of our learners. And it's really important to not forget that. Otherwise, we've seen really just fantastical claims that, for example, media literacy education for a second grader is teaching them that, every single piece of media they will ever encounter is racist in a specific way. And these are some of the arguments that we're dealing with in the education landscape. The other one that I think is really important just in the climate that we're in and reflects, again, sort of a flashpoint in what's happening in the United States right now is core principle 8. And that states that media literacy education affirms that a healthy media landscape for the public good is a shared responsibility among media and technology companies, governments, and citizens. We are in a point where we can no longer sort of assume that educators in the formal classroom will bear the responsibility for doing media literacy education in the entire United States. And simultaneously, we're in an incredibly wonderful place where we are seeing community initiatives, nonprofit initiatives that are doing exceptional work in media literacy education. So we want to validate the work that those organizations are doing, that community groups and grassroots efforts are doing in media literacy education. And we also want to nudge systems and institutions, such as technology companies, to understand that they are part of this as well. So quality media literacy education must rely on a shared responsibility from these companies. And in the moment that we are in, where, if you follow maybe some of the ways in which groups like Meta or other companies have been called to Congress to testify on their impact about their technologies, we felt it was really important to remind the greater community and to anybody who is trying to understand what media literacy education looks like, that we have to hold companies responsible for their end of the bargain, for not being ignorant to their impact on society, for understanding how their users are actually using their media and the impact of those uses. And so we wanted to call attention to that. So I know we are at the point, I have one more slide, but you will get these slides, and it just summarizes the core principles in total. So you'll be able to take a look at that. I definitely want to make sure we end on time so that if there are questions or other conversations, we can get to that before we take our first break. So thank you for having me, and hopefully this was a useful dive into what is quite a long document. So I'd be happy to connect with anybody else more on that.
Thank you so much, Megan. Yes, and thank you for sharing the documentation and everything with us. It's much appreciated. There are two questions in the chat at the moment, which I just wanted to put there. They're probably more general in a way, but let me put them to you anyway. And as you said, we are going to try and make sure that we do actually have the session ending on time. First of all, I'd just like to take maybe the question from Isabel. I have to go back and find it. Here we are. Isabel Worth, an AFP. She asks about what do you implement to make sure your audience, teachers, youth, whatever, will have a chance to apply what they've learned in your training workshops in practice, I presume. Do you see the question there?
Yes, I'm looking for it now. Yes. Okay.
Okay.
So this, that's a great question. And one thing to know a little bit about NAMELY's work is that we represent such a wide network of teachers, of activists, of nonprofit organizations, of creators, that we often partner with other organizations in training. So our main area of training for NAMELY is our summer virtual conference. And that's where we do most of our professional development for teachers. And so that's where we help them understand what this looks like, to conceptualize how this might be activated in the classroom. And so that's sort of the setting in which we give them a chance to apply what these might look like. So, as you all know, with a virtual conference and the question we were talking about before, evaluation and assessment, it's really hard to understand and to be able to accurately measure how a teacher or an educator might be doing things differently in their classroom based on something that they learned with us in a summer conference. So we're always looking for ways to better understand how they apply that and what that looks like and how their learning has shifted. But we don't have a great metric for connecting what they learn in the conference to seeing how that activates in the classroom.